Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the government and political correspondent for this show. And as folks know from our previous show, we would from time to time venture outside the government political area and venture into non-governmental agencies, nonprofits, and particularly those that benefit charities. And part of that is my own personal belief that government isn't always the answer for everything. And so in this segment, we want to focus on charitable organizations, particularly the St. Croix Valley Foundation. My guest today is Steve Wilcox. Steve, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
And the reason you're on today, as opposed to anyone else, is because you serve in what capacity?
Well, I've been serving for the last 18 months as the board chair for the St. Croix Valley Foundation, and it's been just a great honor to serve in that capacity.
How long is that designation as chair of the board?
24 months.
Okay.
And I've been serving on the board for 6 years, but this last 18 months has been kind of in a volunteer leader role.
Now, so 6 years with St. Croix Valley Foundation. We're going to explain to the folks what that is, but I want to give them a little bit more background of you as far as your volunteerism. I mean, one of the recipients of the Service Above Self Award from our Rotary Club, the Hudson Daybreak, which I'm also a member of. And you've been in Rotary how many years?
This will be my 34th year in Rotary.
And then how many years in scouting?
This will be my 36th year in scouting.
So you started in scouting first.
Yeah, I did.
And you do have a day job, though, right?
I do have a day job, yes. I'm involved with 3 others in Resultants for Business. We're business advisors for companies that are growing, and we work with leadership teams in the development of systems and growth, and primarily in strategic execution.
And you do that for-profit businesses, but also nonprofit organizations.
We've served nonprofit organizations. Most of our work is with profit organizations, and so companies that range from $1 million or $2 million on the low end, all the way up to about 100. We've got a client that's 130 million right now, so some pretty good-sized organizations.
Now, the 36 years in scouting, how did that start?
That started on the invitation of a gentleman from Hudson. I was just out of college at River Falls, and he asked me to be an assistant scoutmaster here in Troop 140, and I accepted the opportunity. My wife-to-be was still at Madison completing her degree studies, and so I spent some evenings with the boys at Troop 140, and that's grown into a position now serving the Northern Star Council on their board.
So between your time in Rotary, and I should also mention, in addition to receiving the local award, Service Above Self, you've received other awards between Scouting and Rotary, and have served as an international capacity for Rotary as well as a district governor, former governor, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So having all those positions and being so involved, I mean, you're, I guess, a model for folks like me. I'm just a baby in Rotary, having been in less than 5 years and president-elect now of the Daybreak Club. But one of the things that impresses me is the people in this community and in all communities that are willing to give of their time and talents for improving community. And our motto in our local club is enhancing opportunities for youth and creating a better community for all. So with that segue, I guess this is what St. Croix Valley Foundation is kind of all about, isn't it? It's creating a better community?
It's creating a better community as a St. Croix Valley, but also creating better communities within the St. Croix Valley. And that's what drew me to the service opportunity when I was asked to consider the board 6 years ago. I thought, what a great organization. It is in its, we're in our 16th year this year. It was founded by a group of gentlemen and ladies of leadership here in our valley, principally in the Stillwater and Hudson communities, that got together and threw some checks in the middle of the table and said, we're going to get her started. And those founders are quite surprised today at the size that we've grown to, the breadth that we've been able to expand into in terms of the aspects of leadership and philanthropic reach that the St. Croix Valley Foundation has experienced.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Now, your slideshow that you have for us, and we're going to try and interpose that with
Comments today, yeah?
That's right, and it's called Partners for the Future. And I know how important partnerships are for the foundation, how you build on it. Can you just give us an introduction to how the St. Croix Valley Foundation, which is, again, a nonprofit, it's basically a 501c3, correct?
Correct.
And using those charitable principles, partners then with other organizations to build everyone's future. So.
Well, the St. Croix Valley Foundation is a philanthropic nonprofit umbrella over the valley. And so if we think of it as an umbrella and some instances of representation, and as a foundation in others. It's a foundation because we're supporting large agencies, Turning Point Shelter in River Falls, Family Means in Stillwater as examples, a food shelf, or some other organization of nonprofit philanthropy and support and supporting services.
So I like your analogy is both an umbrella and a foundation.
Correct.
So your first couple slides here, it says 15 years of investing in the St. Croix Valley. You had mentioned how it started about 16 years ago, but with just checks thrown in the middle of a table, and how it's built over the years. So this one slide we got, it's labeled Partnering for the Future. We show the beginning in 1997 at zero, and this is measured in millions of dollars up the left-hand side.
That's correct.
And
it used to be measured in tens and twenties back in 97, but
Sure.
The philanthropic engine that we've experienced, and of course, like all of us, we experienced some dips in our investments and our retirement funds in the 2007 to 2009 time period. The foundation took a bit of a dip as well, but not as dramatic as many. The investment policies and so on has allowed this foundation over this tenure of growth to be in excess of $28 million at this stage in time.
well, once I learned of the foundation and what it's doing, and I hope that that's kind of our purpose here today, is to get the word out more. And this show, it does get rebroadcast in other areas that are not included currently in the St. Croix Valley Foundation, maybe give them ideas for what can be done. So you mentioned here in some of the highlights that it's a fundraising program for 30 nonprofits. You gave us some examples of some nonprofit organizations, and that there are 7 affiliated community foundations. I think there's mentioned 6, but what are the 7?
Well, I'll start with the overall view of the St. Croix Valley founders, and that view had to do with looking at the St. Croix River as the asset that is common to both Wisconsin and Minnesota. And the founders were from both states and viewed the St. Croix Valley as one. And so in that context, the Chisago County, Washington County, Polk, St. Croix, and Pierce County leadership combined those 5 into the initial geography of the St. Croix Valley Community Foundation. What's been unusual in our most recent initiative, and I'll tie that quickly into why this is expanding, is that we are currently leading an effort towards consideration as a national heritage area. And in a national heritage area, we're looking at the stories and the value of our heritage in terms of a designation. There are 49 of these areas in the United States as designated by our Congress, and we're seeking to be the 50th. Now, in that designation, it's about a 3-year process. Well, we've focused beyond our 5-county area and into the 11-county watershed of the St. Croix. And by going into those 11 counties, the 5 that we serve on a founding basis, we've been able to really expand our messaging of philanthropy and the opportunity to give and receive within that context. So as we move on into our primary areas of delivery, we have 7 affiliates. And an affiliate is a community-based, typically geographically outlined by a school district. And in Minnesota, there's a Chisago Lakes area affiliate.
In Chisago County.
Correct.
Okay.
And then Stillwater School District north of I-94. And then south of I-94 is the Lower St. Croix Area Foundation, which is the 5 communities that are down below the I-94 interchange. So then you cross into Wisconsin, and we start in River Falls, going north into Hudson, New Richmond, and then Amory. And that pretty much covers the larger populations of our 5-county area, and we currently have a lot of interest in some of our smaller community populations as well. So the Baldwin and Roberts environment, the Osceola, St. Croix Falls environment. One last rather large populace is Forest Lake, and there's an initiating group there as well. So we have an opportunity to start to fill in the holes of our affiliate constituency in the days ahead.
And to have an affiliate, it just means that there's at least one nonprofit from that school district that is holding its funds with St. Croix Valley Foundation?
And actually what it is it's the umbrella of that community. And so as an example, with Hudson or River Falls, New Richmond or Stillwater, these are area community foundations which act as the highly visible umbrella of that community, as opposed to the St. Croix Valley Foundation, which is that umbrella over the whole 5-county area.
Okay, so that's a good point of clarification. You got St. Croix Valley, which you would show that basically we don't have the river's not a border. In fact, it serves as the centerpiece to all of this.
That's correct.
And then you have different communities that may have 1 or 2 organizations within them, or it could serve several.
Correct.
Hudson Community, for instance, there's, I know that for one, the Hudson Daybreak Rotary has a fund that's under the umbrella of the Hudson Community, which is under then the St. Croix Valley Foundation. Is that an example of your tiers?
That's a perfect example of the tiers. And so as the Rotary Fund in Stillwater, Hudson, or River Falls, or New Richmond is under their community's umbrella of the River Falls Community Foundation or the New Richmond Area Community Foundation. These are the affiliate designations.
Okay.
And so those funds are somewhat designated, again, geographically.
Now, we've described now the geographics of this. Mm-hmm. Let's get into a little bit about because I think this is fascinating, and we're talking about the money involved, having started from a few checks, and the leveraging that St. Croix Valley can provide. So we start with this growing donor base, and again, we've got the years on the bottom of this slide. That's and correct. The assets in millions. Now, currently, where are we at when it comes to assets? What are we referring to?
Well, the assets are those held funds that are available for distribution. Some are designated and some are undesignated.
A designated would be like, could be the donor designated or donor advised?
That's correct.
Can you give an example of?
I'd love to. And I think one of the points that I hope our viewers leave with from this conversation, Jamie, is the notion that any of us can be a philanthropist, and that it's not.
We don't have to be Bill Gates.
No, we sure don't have to be Bill Gates. And so, I'll give an example, a personal example. My wife Terry and I and our son and daughter have put together an Acorn Fund, and an Acorn Fund is a $0 to $10,000 fund. And the reason I speak of $10,000 is that $10,000 is that point in which you can now distribute.
Okay.
And so any donor could go in and place a check for $10,000 and open up a family or a donor-advised fund on those $10,000 and immediately start distributing a 5% component of that investment out back into the community on their designation.
And you might have another slide that talks about this, but why is the 5% the key part to this?
Well, the investment fluctuations are the biggest component, and so there's a bit of a fee that goes for supporting the entire foundation.
What does that St. Croix Valley charge for that?
1.5%.
Okay.
And so, and then gradually lower on large sums of money. And so we have some large agency funds that are in that category of a reduced fee as an example. But for a donor advised fund, which is typically a family fund or a small organization fund, where they're seeking to designate where those earnings go at a 5% rate per year, those are often family funds. And so like ours, and I was talking about that Acorn Fund, we're funding that up to that 10,000 limit, and we're gaining ground on that. And once we hit that 10,000, then the family can get together on an annual basis or a semi-annual basis and say, all right, out of our designated earnings, where would we like to put those? Well, we'd like to put 20% in the United Way and 10% in the Boy Scouts and 20% to our church, whatever a family would designate.
Okay.
Now, as my wife and I pass on, our son and daughter are still administrating those funds and hopefully adding to those funds. And so that's where that philanthropic engine comes into play. And anyone can start an Acorn Fund at any level. So $500, $1,000 starts the philanthropic opportunity.
But then if you get to a level, and is it always 10,000, or could you set it at a higher level?
Oh no, any level higher than 10,000, but 10,000 is that floor in which the redistribution occurs.
So at 10,000, then obviously you're giving out $500 would be distributed if that were your
that is correct
your floor. But if you set it at 100,000, then you build it up to that 100,000,
Right.
and then the first grant would go out at 5,000.
Or any breakdown of that 5,000. So several grants of 1,000. So it's your designation as the donor.
And but each year 1.5% gets charged on the total balance.
That's correct.
So if and we'll get into historical performances
Sure.
and the outstanding investment record of the St. Croix Valley Foundation. But if in theory, if you had a year where it was 6.5% return, 1.5% would go to the administration, and then you could still have your full 5% grant and then not lose the below that 100,000 level.
That's correct. And in many philanthropic circles, it's referred to as a fund that's underwater, because it's upside down in terms of its earnings versus its grant-making capability.
Okay.
And so it's important to have that floor set in such a way that reasonable and historical earnings make everything whole.
Right, but what we'll see is, given a record, if you have a year where it's 20%, that means that 20,000 being added to that $100,000 corpus, then you pay out the 1.5% and you have a $5,000 distribution. The fund is still growing at that rate when you outperform your...
Exactly, because it's still 5% of the outperformance. So you might be at 120,000, but now you have 5% of the 120 instead of the 100.
Okay. So this growing donor base, we talked about some of the designated funds. There are scholarships involved in different agencies. And so it's grown over the years. And now let's talk about the grant making, which is kind of the fun part. I know in Rotary, we raise a lot of money in communities, and a lot of Rotary groups do. But the fun part is when you're able to give it to the different organizations. And so let's talk about some of that grant making. We've got the history of accumulated grant making, right, where you've given nearly, it says, $12 million in grants over 15 years.
That's correct. And that's $12 million of investment back into our valley based on growth, historical growth of these funds. So for every dollar, $5 is going back out into the St. Croix Valley in some fashion. It's really an amazing opportunity for the wealth of the valley and to help in supporting our nonprofit and agency organizations that serve the valley.
And looking at the things, this is a 15-year grant distribution, and it's color-coded pie chart. Mine is black and white, but
Right,
hopefully
but
the folks in
the viewers will be able to see that in color, and you can see the mix of arts and music and education. Of course, the human services component that we serve the valley with, whether through the food shelf environment or the homeless shelter environment, which we support many, if not all of those in the 5 counties through holding and managing their funds. Civic and environment, I suppose the various service organizations that we have held funds for, like the Rotary example you offered, or Lions or Kiwanis or any organization.
So, and some of these purposes gets back to my introduction to the whole segment, and that is that government doesn't necessarily the answer to everything or the solution. And you've got areas here where government has been either hesitant to go or doesn't have the funds to go into, whether it's arts, music, religion. These are all areas that this can be helped with these donor funds.
Well, and one of the unique pieces about the granting process is because we have areas of interest funds, and so if you and your wife decided that you wanted to take your and redesignate your IRA elements at your death into an area of interest for you and your wife, you could have those monies set in perpetuity at that level. And let's say it's music, or let's say that it's a shelter setting like Grace Place up in Somerset, where you wanted to designate this endowment to Grace Place in perpetuity. You could do that and know that those dollars are destined for that philanthropic outfall.
Now, the next slide says history of gifts. Explain the difference over the history of accumulated grant making with this slide, because one said 12 million for the history of grant making. This one says history of gifts, 31 million. What's the difference?
These are held funds, and so for many organizations, and I'll use the library in Roberts as an example, they were raising through a capital campaign the opportunity to build the new library, which was subsequently named the Mackey Library because of one of the major donors. During that 3-year period of collecting of the funds and the construction of the library, we held their monies. And then there was a day where a check was signed for $1 million out of the St. Croix Valley Foundation, including the lift that they received through the investments, and that paid for that building. And there are other examples, hence the difference in terms
what year was that?
held funds.
When we look at
that would have been one of those dips, because I think that was in like 09 or 08 when $1 million went out just on a single check, but a building was built and a community benefited.
So these are the annual gifts in any particular year. Is that what?
Yes, sir, it is.
Each of these bars represent, and so the cumulatively it's up over 31 million now over those 15 years.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about the leveraging. So we've talked about all the good that St. Croix Valley has done, and it involves many non-profit organizations and non-governmental entities. But what's this notion of leveraging? Why don't you explain that?
Well, the leveraging piece becomes the professional value that the St. Croix Valley Foundation provides for so many nonprofit organizations in the areas of investment and in the areas of the administrative support, and also in the relational development, which is the donor database. When you start to think about our small nonprofits in and around the Valley area, they don't have the resources for back office support and marketing and the investment management of their portfolio or their database. Their database might be as simple as an Outlook contact database. which is, of course, very functional, but it is not a philanthropic development in nature. We use a database that has thousands of representative contacts in it that are able to be sorted and analyzed in a number of ways to benefit those agencies in terms of support from just a donor development and cultivation standpoint. So if you were to walk into a small nonprofit indicating your interest, of course, they're going to want your business card and want to know how you might support either in volunteer time or in philanthropic and financial resource. And so how to capture that information and then continue to cultivate and develop it so that your IRA, let's say at your passing, might have the opportunity of serving that particular nonprofit, even though they might be a one-person professional or a part-time or a totally volunteer. Take Operation Help as an example. Here in our community of Hudson in this greater St. Croix area, Operation Help is all volunteer, 100% volunteer. They don't have that, the database component and the back office and marketing pieces. And
Right.
so
Or
that's
an
the
investment
overview.
manager.
Or an investment manager, exactly. And so their funds are held with us.
One question just popped in my head because I understand the administrative support and how important that is because you know, you don't have the funds in some of these small organizations to keep somebody on even on a part-time basis, where you can have somebody that's professional, skilled, many years of experience doing this and on a larger scale, but still helping, that makes sense. And the same thing with the investment management. As far as the relational development now, is there some kind of, is there a privacy component to this? Because you said somebody wants to donate to a particular fund. Just because I donate to the Hudson Community Fund doesn't mean that I'm going to be contacted by Chisago
Oh,
Lakes.
gosh, no. Gosh, no, and thank you for bringing that up. No, this is a highly confidential environment, and so the donor database allows for that privacy and management under a controlled setting. And your designation of your interest as an individual donor, Jamie, would be outlined and defined, but purely for the purposes as you designate. So this is not an open season mined database by any means, but each of these individual nonprofits seeks to have their own pool of participants. And so in that context, those participants as a whole are a confidential group to that organization. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. But again, it comes down to administration. You might write a check one year, and then the next year forget, but then there's the reminder there that can be put out by the foundation.
Which we do.
And that organization then doesn't have to worry about making sure that they're doing all of that part of it. And the mailings and all that, that's part of that 1.5%.
That's correct. And to your point, you will receive a reminder that your designated opportunity is coming, and last year you did this. Would you like to duplicate that or change that or whatever? And so that's the donor designated component, is that you control where your philanthropy goes, and you can change it on an annual basis as you wish and your family wishes.
And that frees up time for these smaller organizations to be doing other, the actual service work, or if they want to set off and do fundraising or whatever, they can do that without having to go back and reinvent the wheel.
That's correct, because many of our donors, what they've done is they've taken their philanthropic largesse for a year and placed it, and for many years, and placed it in the care of the foundation, and then they write the checks to all of their nonprofit at one time, and that's that.
Yeah.
And so it's not a monthly, weekly, daily. They know where it's going, and they designate it right out.
And you've named already in our time that we've been taping here several organizations in the community that I know my wife and I have contributed to personally. You wouldn't have to necessarily write all those checks. You could do one check and indicate that percentage-wise you want it to go to those organizations, and that would all be done for you.
Correct.
Okay. That's good to know. All right, now the partnership, let's get into the investment discipline, I guess.
Sure.
What is the performance history here? I don't know if I'm seeing these percentages right since I don't have my glasses on.
No worries, but the performance is one of our proudest moments, because in the last 2 years we have been asked in a survey of community foundations across the United States to submit our performance, and we are in the top 7 in the United States.
7% or?
7 organizations
Okay.
in the United States in the Community Foundation Environment Surveyed in performance. Last year we were at over 20% in our returns, net fees. So it certainly is an area of pride for our organization.
Can you explain this slide here where it says through June 30th, 2011, all right?
Right.
So you have a long-term portfolio. What does the benchmark represent?
The benchmark is that number that we strive to achieve as our in terms of our returns. And so our finance and investment team, and it is an internal team, our finance and investment committee it meets on a regular basis, and then twice a year we bring in a group of 20 to 30 of the financial advisors and chief financial individuals of organizations throughout the St. Croix Valley. And they meet for a couple, 3 hours and discuss the shifts in strategy and so on.
Is that every quarter, you said?
No, it's every 2 quarters. So we do it two times a year, and then our Finance and Investment Committee takes that information and actively
So you set
manages.
these goals. Benchmark does not necessarily mean industry average by any means.
That's my understanding, and I'm not a finance whiz, but
But it looks to me like, just looking at quarter, because when I get my statement, you know, for the retirement fund that I have, and they give performance for the last quarter, the last 12 months, and then year to date, 3 years, and that's what you're showing here with this slide, is that you're basically outperforming your benchmark.
That's correct.
Consistently.
Consistently, and again, a source for pride, but more importantly, a source for confidence. Because I think in these times, and particularly over the last 4 years, there's been a lot of volatility. And although we have had our dips, we haven't gone as low as the markets and so on because of the mix of investments, and are outperforming as you observe the benchmarks.
Okay. So in a competitive fee structure, that's basically meaning you're not paying for what most of us would have to pay for a financial advisor, because these people are volunteering their time?
That's correct. And so unloaded, basically, in terms of the fund management.
And now you've used these terms already. We go to the next slide, which is types of funds. Endowment funds would be similar to what Rotary Daybreak has, that grow and they benefit the community. We're in the process still growing that. We've set a number or floor, what we want to grow to, and at that point when it hits it, then we will do the 5% distribution.
That's correct. That's correct, and again, those are typically community-based, and so those endowment funds stay within the communities and to serve those nonprofits and the needs of those communities. And so that's why it's so important with our community foundations, the Stillwater Community Foundation, the River Falls, the Hudson, the New Richmond, Amory, and so on. It's so important for those community foundations to have endowment funds and structure. I believe New Richmond is in the $1.5 million to $2 million environment. Hudson just passed $2 million in resource. Stillwater, I believe, has $7 million in resource. And so when you start to get to these endowment levels, that's a lot of philanthropic engine for your community. And so that's why those funds really benefit a specific community, because they're staying within that.
Okay, the next one you said was legacy is the key term. What are those type of?
Well, that's the donor advised fund. That's your family or my family being able to leave a legacy that's designated of sorts. And so our family has a keen interest in in service and scouting and our church and so on, and it allows us to designate where we want our legacy to go, because it's really about legacy giving when it comes to the family environment.
So to set that up, because you used your own family as an example, and so
Sure.
I'll use mine. If we've been writing checks on an annual basis to Hudson Community Fund, for instance, we could, in addition to that, or in lieu of, or in addition to, set up something that says the James Johnson Family Fund, and then those annual checks just go to that fund and build it and sort of form an acorn?
Well, there's two components that you offered there. The first one is that you're supporting the Hudson Community Foundation, which is an important component of the endowment environment, because that allows the Hudson Community Foundation to then distribute on your behalf. And many individuals choose that route. An alternative or additional route to that would be is to set up the Johnson Family Fund, and then that Johnson Family Fund, like the Wilcox Family Fund, fits under the umbrella of the Hudson Community Foundation. So it's still a part of it. We're part of the Hudson Community Foundation, which is under the umbrella of the St. Croix Valley Foundation. It gets a little confusing, but the money stays in town, and that was the intent of it, and it's invested towards the improvements of our community. So you're supporting the Hudson environment, or the River Falls, or the Richmond, or Stillwater and beyond in that way in your own community.
Okay. And then donor involvement, is that? You offer donor involvement, so that's just in addition to this legacy.
Well, and that's taking those
building.
legacy dollars and allowing them to be involved in specific charities of your designation.
And I think the other concept, you've emphasized the local, the legacy part, and the donor, but this meeting a broad range of changing local needs, because organizations that may have been around in '97 might not be around anymore, but tell about that segment a little bit.
Well, if you think over the last 5 years, how critical things have been with the environment of the economy, and how it's affected the Grace Place environment of homeless. It's hard to believe, and yet among us are friends, and we both know individuals who have had difficulties with job and mortgage and
Right.
meeting the needs, and all of a sudden they're in upside down, and what these
the
shelter
statistics
environments.
at Grace Place would back that up.
Absolutely, and so that's a change among us that wasn't there as probably as much 5 or 6 years ago as it has been through these mortgage environments of late. And so that's just one example. But I know those that are running our area food shelves would have an entirely different but supportive story as to the number of individuals that are using those services. So,
And that's why offering this mix of donor designated, but also the general funds like the Hudson Community, whatever, then they can make those decisions based on changing needs from one year to the next, where resources maybe need to be emphasized.
that is exactly correct.
Okay.
Yep,
Well,
that's
why don't you, we've got a few more minutes here,
Sure.
but I wanted to, you brought with you an example in the slideshow of somebody who has decided to make philanthropy, a great part of their life, and in fact, multiple generations. So why don't you do that?
I'd be happy to, and there'll be a couple of slides that support this particular story, and there's many stories throughout the valley that support the concept of giving and the legacy component. Nate Jackson is a real gentleman who is a leader in the River Falls community. Along with his wife Linda, formed the Nate and Linda Jackson funds, and those are a piece of 3 generations of funds. Nate's parents have funds, and their son and daughter are now involved in building their legacy as well.
Well, and I see in one of the slides here, his own grandmother also placed her home in a life estate.
Exactly.
So
actually, we're getting into the fourth generation with Nate and Linda's children. As these philanthropic gestures move through a community, as the Jackson family is representing in the River Falls community, that's where the real traction comes into play. Nate, as an example, is a business and financial advisor in the River Falls community for a long, long time. And so he's well known and highly visible. But where his real visibility came into play was when he was one of the founders of the River Falls Community Foundation. And he was also one of our board members at the St. Croix Valley Foundation for 6 years. And so for 10 years, he served the River Falls Community Foundation on their board and developed the strategies down there. And for 6 years, he worked on the umbrella where he chaired our finance and our donor services committees. And so through all of that legacy time, he's had a real impact in terms of how he's been able to help grow the two foundations in his likeness. And as you can see from the slide overview of he and Linda and the discussion of how they got involved with philanthropy years ago through his parents and an exchange student and so on, and all of that came into play. But that whole situation with the exchange student from New Guinea and how his family in a mission environment moved to New Guinea, and he lived there for a year or two, and they saw the haves and the have-nots. It was a turning point for him, and a gift his parents gave him in terms of realization. So I
think in the one slide here
with
that show Nate and Linda,
right.
and it says how they use they both have they have a donor advised fund, and then they also have annual giving, and then they contribute to an endowed fund, and then they also have an estate plan, so that when they're no longer here, there's going to be giving further into that endowed fund.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure of Nate and Linda's entire strategy, but I'll speak to a general strategy in which life insurance can be designated in terms of beneficiary, and homes and property. All of these are resources and vehicles for philanthropy. And
3M stock.
Yes, 3M stock, Anderson stock here in the Valley.
And we're starting to get into an area that I think ought to be a separate, and we've got
Truly.
some great financial advisors on the specifics of that, because there's huge tax advantages.
Yes, there is.
The presentation we had the other day at Rotary, explained that. But I think folks, maybe one hesitation in giving might be the uncertainty with an economy, and uncertainty if I'm going to live to 100, am I going to outlive my money and so forth. But that's where making a good life estate plan can take care of that, because if it's based on percentages, depending on how much you use, rather than stating flat amounts of money, because you don't know how much things are going to grow and what the economy is going to do. But there's ways that you can give and have that satisfaction of giving while you're alive, but then also having the satisfaction of knowing that when you're no longer here and you don't need that money anyway,
right.
maybe your kids don't need all of that,
Right.
That you can give back, continue to give to the community in a way that's endowed, and it's continue to give year after year after year. And we have several foundations and endowed funds in this community that happens.
You bet.
Well, Steve, thanks a lot for your time and explaining this, and thank you so much for your service to the community through this and in the other ways. And I just encourage our listeners to and viewers to contact the St. Croix Valley Foundation if they want to know how they can get something started, or if they've already got something started, how they maybe can expand their giving or designate it in a specific way. They can contact you. How else can they contact the foundation?
We've got a crack team at the St. Croix Valley Foundation, 5 ladies who make the entire Rubik's Cube work. They're twisting the colors every day to line everything up. And Jane Stevenson is our leader. She's our president and can answer about any question that a donor would have. And so,
is there a website? Do you have? Is it SCV? SCRVF.org?
You've got it,
Okay.
St. Croix Valley Foundation.org. And so
Makes it easy. It's the acronym
Yep.
.org.
Or Google St. Croix Valley Foundation, and it's top of the list.
And the Cracker Jack staff that you talked about, they're located where?
They're located right downtown, just a couple of doors down from the Hudson Chamber over the Windsor Stube restaurant, the German restaurant.
So they could be contacted, and if individuals wanted some counseling, for instance, on how that, there are people that they have a list of folks that they could refer them to, whether
We
it's
have
Nate Jackson or other people similar
Exactly.
to him.
Many who are well versed in estate planning and financial management. We have two excellent with Jane Stevenson and Margie Miller at our offices who can sit down with a prospective donor and answer questions and help guide them and their family or their organizational wishes. So I think people think that the only way to be really philanthropic is to set up a family foundation, nonprofit, or some type of vehicle, and that's not the case with this environment in the Valley. All of that philanthropy can still be controlled and still be in a nonprofit environment without all of the nuts and bolts that go with it from a personal standpoint or management standpoint.
Okay, well, very good. Steve, thanks again for coming on the show, and thank you for watching another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. Please remember to think about your community, and if you don't have one, you're watching this and you don't see something like this in your community, contact the St. Croix Valley Foundation, and they would help you with ideas of how this could spread.
That's right. Going to line it up.
Very good. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
And thank you.